Additional goodies are now available through the Shadiversity Teespring storefront, such as posters and cushions. Get your very own Super Mega Awesome Castle poster today, because matriculations! Link in the description.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and welcome to my review of Hogwarts from the Harry Potter series. Specifically the Hogwarts from the movies, because of course, Hogwarts was actually shown to us visually in the movies, whereas in the books, you need to use your own imagination. So, interesting thing about Hogwarts, from the very first time that I watched any Harry Potter movie, I never actually thought of Hogwarts as a castle. For me, I always saw it as, well, it's a school, kind of like a university that was built in a fantasy castle/gothic kind of way. And I could not recall at any time during the movies that Hogwarts is actually referred to as a castle, but my wife got the audiobooks and she was listening to them, and I'm listening to them now as well. I'm a couple books in, and Hogwarts is referred to specifically as a castle constantly. And for me, who loves historical, authentic castles, that is a lofty claim. So we need to check if Hogwarts would actually qualify as a castle, and even if it does, what type of castle would it be? I'll also be looking at how functional this structure is in defending its occupants and enabling them to repel attackers. I'll be looking at its realism, the architectural styles used in its designs, and anything else that comes to my mind throughout this review. As I was preparing to do this review, researching, trying to find as many pictures, detailed pictures of Hogwarts as I could find, it was actually far more complex than you might suppose, to the point that I realized to do this review properly, I would need to make something special for it. One of the reasons why is because Hogwarts' design has actually changed through the movies, yet after The Prisoner of Azkaban, Hogwarts' design actually became far more standardized and was kept very much the same up until the Deathly Hallows, and even at the Deathly Hallows, only a couple of changes were made. So I looked up as many images of the more standardized version of Hogwarts that I could find, because we need to see Hogwarts from every angle, its full layout, which is something that is hard to find on the internet, especially just from shots from the movies. Though there are some more detailed shots than others, there are certain angles that are barely ever shown. Even on models that are made of Hogwarts, the pictures of these models are usually always from what you would assume is the frontward angle of the school, which always shows the Great Hall. So after looking up several different types of layouts for the school, as well as referencing from the movies as much as possible to confirm different design things, I have made this. Yes, a full 3D model of Hogwarts, the school for witchcraft and wizardry. My intention for this model was to not do all the finer details, every window where it needs to be, but get the larger details right. The different buildings that comprise the whole school, their position and size in relation to the land roundabout, to build a complete picture from every angle. And so now, with this wonderful model before us, we can get into this review. I want to address the main question that I already referenced, and that is Hogwarts a castle? This is a far more complex question than many people realize, because it comes down to what do you define as a castle, and different people have different definitions. And the thing that I have had to acknowledge throughout my study of historical castles is that there is more than one true definition of what a castle is. The people in the medieval period defined castles differently to what people in the Renaissance defined what a castle was. And indeed, the definition has evolved throughout history to the point that there are actually several types of castles. The most true and authentic castle is a castle that fulfills or is capable of fulfilling the purpose that proper medieval castles were meant to fulfill, and that is a structure that is capable of defending the residents who live inside it and also enable them to effectively repel any attackers. That is also built with medieval style architecture and battlements, because a castle is a distinctly medieval thing, to the point that if you were to look at a structure from another culture that is capable of fulfilling the same purpose of that a medieval castle was supposed to do, you could call it a castle, but you wouldn't call it a medieval castle. You would generally call it a something else castle, like a Japanese castle or a Chinese castle or whatever type of castle. So then, is Hogwarts a castle, and what type is it? First and foremost, and this is the most obvious one, Hogwarts definitely fills the requirements of a fantasy castle, because not every fantasy castle is a functional, defensible castle that would have been defined a castle in the medieval period. But in terms of the common characteristics that you see the most iconic fantasy castles possessing, Hogwarts has this in spades. So it is actually a brilliant representation of a fantasy castle. So what is it doing really well? Well, it's two things. The first thing is a combination of architectural styles, that being of medieval castle style architecture and Gothic cathedral style architecture. In fact, these two architectural styles are very prominent on Hogwarts. You can actually look at and easily identify each major building that was built in one of these two styles. Have a look at this picture here. Here is Hogwarts as a whole. And then here are all the buildings that are in the medieval castle style. And I say style because they're not historically accurate to how they were exactly built in the medieval period, and I'll get to that because this is the second part that fantasy castles usually have that define them as fantasy castles, and that makes them distinct from historical castles. But this is what we see, the medieval styled buildings, and then here are the Gothic cathedral style buildings. And then on some of these Gothic cathedral style buildings, we have medieval styled towers put on their corners to just give it that additional medieval flair. But like, these Gothic style buildings are actually very accurate, with a slight difference to the next part that defines a fantasy castle to be a fantasy castle, and that is size. Fantasy castles generally are way bigger than what historical functional castles were. The Gothic parts, not so much, and there are some buildings here and there that are of a moderate realistic size, but I think the best example of the size increase that we see here on Hogwarts is this main primary central tower. Look at it. It is ridiculously big, and in fact, it is comically big. No medieval castle has ever had a tower this big. The other hugely impractical thing about this massive tower is the weight that will be pressing down on the corbels on the extended parts of the tower that's sitting above the lower floors. Corbelling can support a decent amount of weight, like battlements and stuff like that, but additional floors and then a massive roof like that, very impractical, if not full-blown impossible. The next part about size is that Hogwarts has a ridiculous number of buildings that comprises its whole. Now, when I say ridiculous, I'm not saying ridiculous in the sense of it needs this many buildings for a school. I'm saying ridiculous in the sense of a medieval castle. Medieval castles like this rarely ever had as many separate buildings like this. So there were some cases where they had far more than people realize. They weren't just a single keep. And oftentimes the surface area was actually much larger than people realize in regards to what the outer wall actually surrounded. But Hogwarts here has a lot of buildings, which is great for a fantasy castle, just not something you often see on historical castles. The closest comparison to a historical medieval castle that has a lot of buildings, not as many as Hogwarts, but still a lot, is Malbork Castle, one of the largest castles in the world by surface area, and just have a look at all the different buildings that comprise its whole. In fact, Malbork is a pretty good historical comparison to Hogwarts in terms of size and number of buildings. And when I say size, I'm referring to the number of buildings, because the actual size of those buildings themselves, well, they are not as big as Hogwarts. They're pretty big, but Hogwarts is much bigger. The other elements that make Hogwarts a really distinct fantasy castle are how pointed these tower roofs are. This is a very iconic visual style that was promoted quite a lot by the Disney castle. But the historical origin of these beautiful big pointed towers actually come from later style castles, and these are the castles that were built towards the very end of the medieval period and into the Renaissance. The best example that I can think of this, and yes, I'm totally going to butcher the pronunciation, so get ready for it, is Chateau Pierrefonds. This is the castle that was used to represent Camelot in the Merlin TV series, and was also one of the distinct inspirations for the Disney castle. This and several other sources like classic Gothic style architecture like Notre Dame, and of course Castle Neuschwanstein. But Pierrefonds is one of the most beautiful examples of very late medieval castles, specifically of the French design. And also note, Pierrefonds is actually rebuilt and renovated a bit after the medieval period, so it's a bit more modern in that sense, but it certainly reflects what traditional late medieval French castles were like, as shown by these period illustrations. And what you will notice here are the peaked roofs on the towers. The next distinct fantasy element that Hogwarts does in spades, and just loves this, are the turreted side towers that are sticking onto many of the actual towers of Hogwarts. You see them here, 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 and here. And then someone just went overboard and did a triple, and I'm not confident that this would even be architecturally possible. I just don't see enough support for the third turreted little tower. Now, I call them turreted towers because they're actually too big to be castle turrets. Several of them are just legitimately the size of full-blown towers that are just stuck on the side of other towers in the same manner that medieval turrets were. But it looks great, okay? It's one of those classic fantasy castle designs. While we're on the subject of architectural impossibilities, I will point out the interesting kind of towers that stick up in the middle of some of these buildings. So have a look at these buildings, we see the roofline, and sitting in the middle is a nice pointy tower. And I think they've added these just to get that kind of towery look. So there's pointy towers everywhere, all over the place. The issue here is what is holding them up? I mean, specifically, if we have a look at the Great Hall, we know what's underneath it because we've seen inside the Great Hall, and the answer is nothing! And this is a stone tower, okay? The roof would not be able to support this tower at all. I mean, of course, yes, then there's magic. I acknowledge that. So yes, we can just say magic is holding this up, as well as the turreted towers that are, you know, sitting on another turreted tower. Architecturally, there's too much weight too far away from the actual main supporting structure for it to be stable. But magic, and I wonder if that might have been why they purposely did some of these, you know, designs that were architecturally impossible, just to show that it's a magical structure, and so part of how it's able to even stand is through magic as well. So because of these things that I've pointed out, I really have to say Hogwarts is one of the best fantasy castles that I've ever seen. It is really beautiful. So in terms of the world setting, where the characters refer to Hogwarts as a castle, let's go to the castle or get back to the castle. They are very justified in doing that because Hogwarts is as much of a castle as many other buildings that have been called castles throughout history. The Disney castles and many chateaus that people as well call castles, even though they actually have no real defensive ability. They are not real castles in the sense of what a castle originally was. And this is simply because castle actually is more of an umbrella term that can refer to many different things, but if you were to be a purist and only define a castle as to what they were in the medieval period, well then no, Hogwarts isn't a real castle, but it's a fantasy castle, absolutely. So then why isn't Hogwarts a real castle, or a properly fortified castle, or a medieval castle? Well, of course, you have the architectural differences and the impractical and impossible sizes and designs of certain parts of the buildings, but then we have some of the crucial weaknesses in its fortified state. There are just massive holes in its design from a military perspective. Let's go in and take a closer look at those. I have to say, once actually completing the full model and looking at Hogwarts from every single angle, it actually did much better than I was expecting, though of course it ultimately fails. But still, there are some parts of it that honestly surprised me in regards to approaching a functional castle status. There are some parts on the castles that actually have walls, supposedly protecting certain areas, that also have crenellations atop them. So that made me think, oh, all right, there's hope for it. But before I go in close to those elements, the biggest weakness is that the primary entrances of Hogwarts don't have any proper protections or barriers preventing people from just walking right on in. And of course, what I'm referring to here are proper gatehouses. Now, interesting thing about the main entrance to Hogwarts, this big beautiful bridge, is that this bridge actually wasn't here on all of the Harry Potter movies except the Deathly Hallows. You see, this bridge in all the previous movies actually connected the courtyard to this building right here. And the students actually entered this courtyard via the boathouse below. The model that I have made here with the big bridge running from the courtyard is actually not fully representative of how Hogwarts has been depicted for most of the movies. But the reason why I chose to keep it there is it's an obvious and practical thing in just having a primary big nice entrance into the courtyard. And also, Hogwarts is a magical thing. I mean, the internal stairs move, so why can't the external bridge move? It kind of fits in with the lore that Harry Potter has already established. But the interesting thing about this bridge is defensively, not even having it there would actually be better because it has no gatehouses. Having an undefended entrance that people can just ride on in is actually worse than not having the entrance at all. Better yet would be to have the entrance and, of course, proper gatehouses on it. And all the things that I mentioned about properly defending gatehouses applies to the wooden bridge behind. And the unfortunate thing about this is that these are both really big missed opportunities. By having such a crevice in between an entrance and, the place that you have to approach the castle, provides an incredibly effective natural defense for the castle and anyone trying to attack it. And it also means it gives you a great opportunity to put two gatehouses on the bridges that would connect the castle to the direction of approach. And it seems like whichever team, worked on designing Hogwarts kind of had that in mind, because on the one area where Hogwarts does not have a natural defense or a natural barrier between the main castle body and everywhere else, there's actually a wall cutting it off. It's like they knew, we need to put a wall here, otherwise people can waltz right on in. Well, if you could have thought of that, why couldn't you have thought of that? Hey, a gatehouse would have been really helpful at stopping Voldemort and all the giants trying to waltz across this bridge to attack the school! All those poor stone soldiers just standing there to be demolished with no proper defenses to help them! Because this is the thing, going over to the part of the castle that has this wall, and my goodness was it hard to get angles and confirmation on what this wall was like. But eventually, by scouring the internet and finding a good angle, was I able to get confirmation on this wall. So yes, this wall has a gatehouse, yet there's another kind of gatehouse part that is just two towers side by side, and there's nothing in between. That's stupid beyond reason. I mean, why even have a wall if you just have an area open? Yes, it bottlenecks and funnels people to go through in that direction, but still, put a gate on it, my goodness. So if you put a gatehouse on this, open area in between the walls here, and gatehouses on the bridges that lead to the main entrances of Hogwarts, Hogwarts would have actually qualified as a functional castle, a fortified functional castle, which is such a pity because it's so close, it's almost there. And with these natural defenses as well, it could have been really, really good, but it doesn't have it. It breaks my heart. And then there's another big blunder that also ruins Hogwarts' ability of being a functional proper castle, and that is in regards to this side wall that is walling off the part of Hogwarts that doesn't have natural terrain defending it. And remember how I said I was actually surprised to see that, hey, there's a wall here and it's got crenellations on it, a proper battlement. But then upon closer inspection, scouring through the movies to try and find where these walls are actually shown, the crenellations are not big enough. They only come up to someone's chest height. It's just a barrier to stop people from falling off. It's not a proper functional battlement. And for additional confirmation, look at this scene here where the two twins are standing atop one of the buildings on Hogwarts getting ready for the big assault from Voldemort. Look at the size of that crenelle. It's pittance. All the crenellations on Hogwarts are just aesthetic. Proper size Merlons could have been really useful to duck behind when spells were shot at you, in the big final assault, but they are not functional one whit. A tragedy! Now, of course, it doesn't mean Hogwarts can't be classed as a fantasy castle still. As I mentioned, yes, it absolutely is, but my goodness, does it fall short as a functional, fortified castle. But still, one of the best fantasy castles I have ever seen. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again. Until that time, farewell.